Oh, it's
10:31.
so,
yeah. Hang on. Let me just go back to the lobby. So I'll monitor the lobby and
see his hair.
Let's have a look. So here we go.
See Con's hair.
Good morning, Dennis. Morning, Con. Morning, Chris. Morning, John.
Morning, Steve.
Morning, Padraig. If you've just joined, if you could mute, please. Morning, Derek. That would be good.
We've really
Alan,
got
if
the
you could
gender
mute.
balance wrong, haven't we? I mean, there is no gender balance. It's entirely male. Oh, Nicola, nice to see you.
Oh, Nicola's here.
Good to see you, Nicola. But
hello. Am I the only girl in the room?
You are the only
no,
girl.
Hillary's here as well.
Hello,
Someone's got the
gents.
radio on, so if you've just joined, if you could turn the radio down or turn your microphone to mute, that would be great. So let's see who it is. Ah, there we go. Found it. That was John Mather. That was probably the news. That was Radio 4. That was probably Radio 4. There we go.
Radio Portugal.
Sorry, or Radio Portugal. Yeah, there we are. There's a few others joining. Morning. If you've just joined, if you could mute, please, that would be great to allow Henry, Bryn, and Hillary and Andy to talk. That'd be excellent. So that's a lot quieter. But let's just mute a few more joining. Morning, Alan. Morning, Aaron. Morning, Brian. Morning, Mark. If you could just morning to everybody. If you could just mute, please, if you're not on the panel, that would be brilliant. If you recently joined, and then we can get going, as they say. Thanks for doing that. Okay, so I think we're ready to start. So welcome everybody to this week's coffee morning. The importance of the state pension as fair for all. Henry is going to be sort of chairing the panel, and we're very delighted to introduce Bryn, Hillary, and Andy for our delight and pleasure this morning. So we are recording. So can we have a thumbs up? Everybody's happy to be recorded. Padraig, yeah, John, Robert, brilliant. Okay, so we are recording. And so without further ado, I will pass over to you, Henry, if we may start.
Okay, yeah, well, this session was billed as fairness. And I guess one of the things that we've all been pondering over the last few months is this question about whether the state pension is fair and whether it's unfair to generations below the boomers, in particular, sort of the millennials and below, and whether the boomers are getting too much out of it as a result of some kind of capture, if you like. Now, I'm going to really kick things off by asking Bryn whether the idea of intergenerational solidarity or solidarity between the generations is dead, or whether he still believes that there's a place for it and whether it exists. So over to you, Bryn.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. I'm always happy to pontificate about these issues. You've said something in the email about a lot of experience, and I certainly have that in spades. That doesn't mean I'm right, of course. And I think that's the important point we need to set straight away, that this is an issue. It's not a technical issue. I can deal with technical issues. This is just the result of your view of what a fair society should be like. And that's not a technical issue. That's a matter of opinion and call it politics if you want, but it's also just part of what you think you would like the sort of society you live in to be like. So I think we need to accept that this isn't something that by throwing statistics we can resolve. It starts and ends really with what sort of society do you want to live in. I also want to take issue from the very beginning with the way in which these debates are framed. Henry phrased it in the introduction, and the questions we were sent mentions generations. And really, I don't think thinking about this issue in terms of generations is a helpful concept at all. the way generations are defined is totally arbitrary. It ignores all sorts of aspects of how people think about the community. It's possibly useless as a way of thinking for people who are selling advertising or marketing. But in terms of determining social policy, I think it's a nonsense. It's widespread, and I'm sort of swimming against the way in which it's framed in articles and even in academic journals. But the main reason why it's nonsense is there's far more variation within generations than there is between generations. And so framing it in generational terms, we have to engage in the debate using those terms, but ultimately we're never going to get a fair society by thinking about it in generational terms. And of course, the way in which I frame it, and it's the start and end of my political thinking, is inequality. And it's inequality of wealth, inequality of income, and what a fair society should do about that. Now, obviously that's relevant to pensions, and often the debate is framed, almost entirely the debate is framed as between the boomers. I'm in fact actually sneak in just ahead of the boomers. I forget who it is who's just ahead of the boomers, but against and you see articles in the press expressing it in this way. In my experience, this is not how most people think about it, because most people don't think about older people, for example, as an amorous bunch that they've got nothing to do with. I think they think about it in terms of their grandparents and their parents and how they are treated and how they are getting on. It's not to sort of reify the concept of a generation. It goes back to what I'm saying is nonsense. It's all about equality, how far within a society we need to redistribute income in order to achieve a fair society. So I think the state pension, I'm a strong supporter of the state pension. I believe in the state pension being provided on a contributory basis. So you contribute whilst you're at work, and your contributions are used to provide the older people when you're at work with a pension. And because you've paid those contributions, you're entitled to expect a reasonable income from people at work when you retire. And a lot people get in terminological problems about whether it's welfare or social security or whatever. I think we're not really arguing about words. What we need to argue, what we need to discuss is what is a reasonable standard of living for people in retirement. And I just start with the premise that we should do as much. Of course, I'm part of the older generation now, but when people are at work, and I think this is a view shared by most people at work, is that they're prepared to pay taxes in order to ensure a reasonable income for their parents and their grandparents. Now, of course, there's a lot of history. It's not a decision taken year by year. There's history here. The promises have been made, commitments were made, people paid contributions throughout their working life in the expectation of receiving a state pension when they retire. Now, the state pension in general terms, there's never been a precise promise of what you're going to get when you retire, but I think it would be reasonable to expect something that offers an adequate standard of living. It just stands to reason. We don't want people in retirement to have to live in poverty. And luckily, the Pensions Commission has done that work for us. We could have a long debate about what is or isn't an adequate income in retirement. But the Pensions Commission, I could argue with some of what they've said, but let's just accept as a first objective what they suggest is a reasonable target. And to achieve that reasonable target, there's got to be a state pension. There has to be a state pension in order to achieve that target. Private pensions, even for those who have luckily been in occupational pension for the whole of their working life, will not achieve that target, the target set by the Pensions Commission, except for a limited group of people who have been particularly lucky. So I'm not sure whether I'm really answering the question. I'm just going to read I'm going to reread the question. Yes, solidarity between the generations for me means the belief of what I think is the majority of people, that they want the people who have reached retirement to get an adequate standard of living. There's all sorts of questions about that. What's the age at which it's reasonable for people to retire? What do we count as an adequate income? And we can debate about those two. But the idea that people at work aren't happy to provide a pension for people who've retired, there's no evidence. The overwhelming evidence is that most people wish and are prepared to provide social justice in terms of an adequate pension.
Thank you, Bryn. I'm conscious that the question of affordability has already been brought up. Thank you, Porrick. We'll come back to that, but I wanted to really pick up with Andy and Hilary, their thoughts on what Bryn has just said. So should I start with you, Andy, and then move to you, Hilary, if that's okay? Have you got any comments?
Thanks so much, and thanks for inviting me today. I do want to try and keep this at the high principle level, because I know we're going to drill down into the detailed things like cost and the current state of basic pension and current issues. And I see it very much like Bryn, but I would just say it's part of the welfare system, that we have education, we have health. These are not provided on a fair basis, other than that general eligibility is consistent over time and between people. People do not get a financially fair return equally in the health system. That goes to people who need healthcare. Similarly, education, which is provided by the funds that everyone contributes towards, is provided differently for people with different numbers of children. So I think pensions are something similar, that it is something that we think is a general good and is provided from generation to generation according to the circumstances at the time, with a broadly similar underlying principle. We don't provide the same healthcare to the current generation of people who need healthcare as we did 50 years ago, because we think it should be somehow fair between the generations. We provide what seems correct now according to the principles of providing good healthcare. And I think pensions needs to be seen in that light. It doesn't mean that we should stand still. I wish the UK pension system stood still a bit more than it has done. We seem to play around a lot more than most other countries I've been involved with, and I think they are, generally speaking, all the better for it. Oddly enough, I think we have been slow in maintaining pensions in accordance with the original ideas, if we go back to Beveridge and even before that, of being insurance against longevity. We have, by not changing the state pension age, and I know that will be touched on later, we have shifted it from being something seen as insurance against longevity to something that people get in their middle age. I mean, I could have had my state pension 9 years ago. Fortunately, I deferred until a few weeks ago, in fact, till a month ago. But I think people's vision of what the state pension provides has changed. And as a result, this question of fairness in different ways and sustainability and solidarity between generations has changed. and enter the discussion. And I feel as if we've inadvertently sowed the seeds of it being thought in that way. It's almost getting to the point of being thought of in a DC way, that people pay contributions worth a certain amount and somehow they should get them back, as we've seen in the many discussions on Twitter over what the role of state pension is, that this idea that everyone should kind of get their money back. And I think that's not what it should be any more than everyone should get the same value of healthcare. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. There's Hilary, huge questions being posed there by Mr. Young and indeed by Bryn. What are your thoughts?
I guess I agree with Bryn that this kind of idea of a war of generations against each other is actually really unhelpful. But I think the generational concept is quite helpful in perhaps more of a Burkean way, of the idea that there's a covenant between our forefathers and us and the generations yet unborn. And you know, I think the coherence of that and the intergenerational solidarity of that is something that I would think is quite important. So the way I would generally explain the pension system is that Generation A has built a pool of assets that belongs to that generation, and it needs to pass those assets on to the next generation. So the second generation can buy those assets by paying the first generation a state pension, or it can buy it by actually buying the shares that the first generation has bought. So that's private sector pensions and public service pensions. So you know, it's not a handout. It's a payment that kind of embraces the solidarity that comes from a generation passing on its institutions, its public services, its values, and its traditions to the next generation. And I would say it's because all those things are breaking down that people kind of stop believing in a state pension. So I did this exact same debate on GB News the other week, and interestingly, you know, there's a real view amongst the younger generation that when they get to state pension age, the state pension won't be there. And I think that's a really dangerous and unhelpful belief for them to have. And I think it's symbolic of the fact that there's a real a need for us as a society to recreate a belief in a social values, social coherence, and traditions and communities. You know, we need to recreate all those beliefs. This is not pensions problem. It's a political breakdown of political institutions problem.
It's almost societal, isn't it? That we have got less. But I mean, Bryn's point was more to do with the fact that we still do see old people as our grandparents, and we don't see them as this kind of blood-sucking leech on our finances. So I sense there's a slight difference of opinion there between you. Or are you saying that actually Bryn is, you know, are you saying that it is broken down irreparably, or are you saying it could return to a more, can I say, societal?
I think at the individual level, you know, we know from our individual lives that, you know, grandparents aren't sticking it to the grandchildren and, you know, making their lives harder. They're actually working really hard to do all those things like childcare and unpaid work that actually makes the next generation much more productive than they would otherwise be. But I think at the political level, when we start talking about, you know, what do we as a society believe in, that's where I think it is quite tricky, and we've got to recreate some of those traditions and beliefs and you know, almost, you know, national spirit that says that there are things that we all believe in, and some of the things that Bryn suggested I think are the right ones, about everybody having a realistic standard of living, about class being the real issue and inequality being the real issue, rather than some of those other things that are really pushed as corrosive and divisive issues by things like the DEI policies.
We're not going there.
Can I move the debate on a little bit and ask another question? Bryn's talked about fairness as being something between people in a generation. And there are some people who just simply don't see the state pension as fair even within a generation, that there are winners and losers in that process. Do you think that the state pension is doing a fair job, Bryn?
Well, fair enough. You can always point to.
I had fair enough written down here.
Yes.
Is it fair enough?
Yes, it's not the state pension I would design starting from scratch, but it's what we've got, and it's very difficult. One of the interesting things, just to pick up on this from a point Hilary made, this belief amongst younger people that there won't be a state pension when they get to retirement. What's interesting is the sheer persistence of the state pension, the fact that we still have national insurance contributions and a national insurance pension. The fact that this approach to providing some sort of income for the older generation started over 120 years ago, no, just under 120 years ago, and it's still going. So what's remarkable is the persistence of the idea that the state should, the state should provide an institution that redistributes income to those who are over what's broadly recognised as a appropriate retirement age. Now, that's a separate debate, what that age should be, and I suspect it wouldn't be productive to go too deeply into that in the current discussion. Just assume that there is an age over which people can expect younger people to provide them with an adequate standard of living. Thanks to Patrick for reminding me that I'm a member of the silent generation. Not so silent today, but also but is it fair? Well, I'll be interested to hear what the other two say, but and I'll give it a bit more thought and come back.
Andy, I mean, you were very much involved in the design of a single state pension. Do you think it's doing its job, or do you think there are just too many inconsistencies and that it's unfair to certain people and too fair to others?
I'm afraid, Henry, I think this isn't the right question. The state pension doesn't aim to be fair in the way I think you framed the question. As I said earlier, I think this question of fairness, you need to define what fair is. I think it's very fair, according to my definition, that broadly speaking, everyone gets pretty much the same pension when they get to pretty much the same age. And it has been pretty fair over time at that level, in spite of a few changes along the way. It doesn't aim, as I said, to be fair in a DC sort of way. Exactly. My father died when he was 61. He paid his contributions from age 16 to 61 and got nothing from the state pension. A lot of people think that's blatantly unfair. He didn't, in fact, get any ill health retirement before that. He died of a heart attack. And so I can't say that he is part of the rest of the welfare system and would have had plenty of support and plenty money back from that and didn't even get any unemployment benefit. But still, so I don't think that's the right question. I think the question is whether it's achieving the objectives that we set for it. And I think there I do question whether we have drifted into providing it too early, because it's not really the basic, well, it shouldn't be, in my view, the basic support for people who want to retire around the mid-60s. It should be something that is more focused on dealing with longevity and the risk that people don't have money when they get to significantly older. And we need to address many other questions before we worry too much about whether the basic pension is fair. But I do think it is, and I wasn't involved in designing it in any way whatsoever, other than a few discussions with the people who were. But I do think it is broadly achieving its intentions then of providing a reasonable level of income. As we know, a couple who both get the state pension would pretty much meet the PLSA's lowest level of a suitable amount of income, and they wouldn't pay any tax on it. And that seems to me to be pretty good. We're all at the three of us here are actuaries, and a lot of people nitpick around the fact that the increase in the state pension now means that pensioners are paying a bit of tax and all these second order issues. But I do think it's kind of at the right level, and it underpins in a sensible way the rest of savings that people want to save on top. And that seems to me to be at least appropriate. I don't know whether fair is a question.
I'm not pushing back on that, but I mean, clearly we've had lots of discussions, Andy, about things like offsets and CODs and COPs and all that stuff. But I mean, that second order stuff is what you're saying. In practice, you think that the system's working reasonably fairly at the moment, yeah?
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, these are quirks that were decided at the time in order to get quite rapidly to where we want to be with a broadly similar state pension for everyone. And it's just the same as I can't bear discussions about GMP equalisation. I don't think it's fundamental to the pension system, and I can't bear all the nitpicking around state pension either.
Okay, thank you. That's a great.
Fairness. Sorry, my mind has caught up with the issue. Fairness is too often defined as if the state pension were a DC scheme, and he's absolutely right. And it's not a DC scheme; it's a separate mechanism of social sharing. It's not saving; it's sharing. And in terms of sharing, I do have some quibbles. Speaking as someone who has never contracted out, I do have this niggle, which sometimes comes forth about the good deal that people who were contracted out got out of the deal, and it annoys me, but I don't think it invalidates the approach. So I don't. So yes, it's fair.
Okay, Hilary, are you going to counteract that statement, or are you going to agree with it?
I think I disagree with the idea that there are second order effects, because I don't think it's right to look at the basic state pension on its own as if nothing else, there is no other fiscal policy. So, when people say, there are some people who don't need a basic state pension, we shouldn't pay it to them. Those are exactly the kind of people who are paying more than the basic state pension in tax. So we get it back off them. And it's, the welfare system and the tax system needs to be looked at together. And I actually think the universal principle is actually far more important than saying that, there's 1% of people who shouldn't get a basic state pension because they're too rich. Because that whole democratic urge and that democratic principle behind what we used to call dukes to dustmen. I was trying to think of a less gendered expression for that, and I came up with bankers to baristas. The fact that everybody gets a basic state pension, subject to the contributory principle, which, as Bryn has said, is a really important one. The fact that everybody gets the same amount, I think, is really important. And if we're saying it's not fair because some people don't need it, then tax them. If we're saying it's not fair because some people don't live long enough, then I would just argue really strongly that we're trying to provide an income to the living and not an inheritance for the dead. And to me, that's the important thing as a civilized society.
Thank you very much. I like that phrase, income for the living, not an inheritance for the dead. But I would, wouldn't I?
Okay, just to throw in an extra phrase. Social policy shows, experience with social policy across the world, that if you provide pensions for poor people, they're going to be poor pensions. It's just the way the system works. There'll be all sorts of problems. So the universal principle is an essential element in making the system fair.
Okay, I'm going to take out my question about means testing then. But okay, so we have two.
Henry.
Yeah,
I'm not in favour of testing the basic pension, but I think it's worth having it in there since it's something that is being discussed.
We may come back to that in a second, but I want to ask first. There are two big levers for the government to use in terms of affordability on the state pension. One is the revaluation. At the moment, we have a triple lock. We might not have it in the future. And the second is the state pension age. Andy's already touched on this, but I'd be interested in your thoughts about which of those levers should be used, if either of them, to change the state pension. So, Lord Davison-Brixton.
Well, I've got a very good state pension. I was never contracted out, and then, like Andy, I deferred my pension for a long period of, for a number of years, and so following the increase last week, it's looking pretty good. And in a sense, it's that flexibility. People always say there should be more flexibility in the state pension, but there is the flexibility.
What does it mean, deferring? I mean, you defer. Andy said he deferred 9 years and so on. I mean, can you put a number on it? How much extra pension?
Oh, well, you see, this is the big division between the pre-2016 retirees and the post-2016 retirees. Andy and I had a particularly, I have to admit, speaking as an actuary, that it was a particularly favourable deal. Each year we deferred the pension, we got a 10% increase. That's so Steve Webb has cut that to 5% a year for those who retired after 2016, which is probably still a reasonable deal. And so,
so you're getting sort of like close to 20 than 10.
Sorry, I lost that.
So you're getting closer to 20,000 and 10,000 is what you're saying.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
Ooh.
Well, Steve Webb's presenting next week, Bryn. So yeah, you can thank him.
Right. I'm sorry. I shouldn't be probing into personal finances here, but it is a
well.
Huge,
I never about a
right.
bit about telling people how much my state pension. I might say next week, but if I'm there.
Okay.
Well,
sorry, I have to admit I've forgotten your question now.
My question is, which lever is better to use, or should neither be used? The triple lock or deferral of the state patronage?
The thing about the triple lock is we know it works. It has had a significant impact on increasing the basic state pension and the new state pension, increased in ways which just would not have happened otherwise. So if you're one of those like myself who think that those elements of the pension system aren't big enough, then it's the proven way of ensuring we're increasing it towards X. X is the figure which I would agree is adequate. I'm quite clear it's inadequate at the moment. The triple lock is increasing it. What the target is, I don't think anyone, if pushed, would say, well, the triple lock should always apply. If and when we get to a stage at which I think the basic pension is adequate, I'll be quite happy to see the end of the triple lock. It's only required because it's increasing an inadequate level of basic stroke new state pension, and it works. Increasing retirement age, the state pension age, I don't know that works because I don't know what the government will do with the money. They will save some money. Will they necessarily use it to improve the basic state pension? That's a separate issue. As I say, oh yes, that's why I got into talking about personal circumstances. Personally, I exercise that right. I did achieve a higher state pension towards an adequate level by deferring their retirement. The problem with that approach is that the people who are in health and poor expectation of life, and generally who are on low incomes, can't afford to defer their state pension. I could afford to defer it because I was still working But someone who's in less well health, which is of course closely correlated with having been on low income, can't afford to defer their state pension, and so it is a problem. I always get uncomfortable when I sit amongst a group of people talking about well, we should have a higher state pension, when I know that all of them are in reasonable health and they've all got decent pensions. There's a lot of people out there who don't engage in these conversations who aren't in good health and don't have a decent pension. So increasing their retirement age is the people who are hurt by increasing the pension age are those who can't afford to retire. They're the people who get hurt by it, and that really worries me.
Andy, I know you have views on the triple lock and on the state pension age. Can we move on?
Well, yeah, I mean, perhaps this is one topic on which the three of us might have different views. I think the triple lock is a nonsense. I agree that one way or another it is allowing the state pension to trickle up relative to prices and earnings, but it's a ludicrous way to be doing it. We should set an objective for what we think the basic pension level should be. And if we think that's the amount it should be, we should set it at that level. We shouldn't do it in an ad hoc way that may or may not get there by 1, 2, 5, 20 years. There are much better ways. If we do want to phase in an increase to another level, then we should do it. The history of the triple lock is just a political history. The 2.5% is there because Gordon Brown 1 year had to, in increasing the state pension in line with prices, had an increase less than £1. And that, of course, got all the headlines. And so politicians thought, well, we can never have an increase less than £1. 2.5% now is significantly more than £1. It's about £5. And why on earth, as we will find in the next few years, should pensioners get a 2.5% increase when both prices and earnings are probably materially below that? Certainly that's what the OBR think is going to be the outcome, and I see no logic in that. The higher of prices and earnings was something that existed in the 1970s. One of the disadvantages of having old people on this is that people have got a history. For a couple of years, it was the higher of prices and earnings. And that was then abolished by Maggie Thatcher, who pushed it to price increases rather than earnings, which would have been the sensible one, and is what the legislation is now, and is what I think it should be. The funding of state pensions is based on earnings increases. Indeed, whether it's workers or whether it's the general population through taxation, it tends to increase broadly in line with earnings, and that's what it should be. And the legislation was right in moving to that. Now, there is an argument that the old state pension should perhaps receive a higher increase. And I'm not putting that because I've got an old state pension. The whole idea of the basic pension being too low was based largely on the fact that the old basic pension was too low. The new basic pension received a hike anyway. It's broadly in the right area. We could argue whether it should be 30% of median, 35 or 33.
I'm going to cut you short. I'm going to cut you short, Andy, just for a second, because I want to hear Hillary's answer, and I know you have to go, Hillary.
I do. So very quickly, on these points.
Hillary.
So I think I'm more in Andy's camp on the triple lock. I don't really like the triple lock, although I accept Bryn's points that actually it's worked in a pragmatic way quite well. I think if we need to increase the basic state pension, we should just do that rather than rely on some kind of arbitrary mechanism. I think I would accept either wages growth or GDP growth as the thing that should be the way in which we index them. The difficulty being both of those things are actually really tricky to measure. And we know that GDP growth in particular is constantly revised. All of our stuff on wage growth is actually not real data. It's just a survey of employers, and I find it really actually quite unreliable as a measurement. On state pension age, I mean, in theory, I think there's an argument that says let's raise the state pension age to 75, say, but have a mechanism where between 66 and 75, there's a light touch mechanism that says if you're not well enough to work, you can get access to it early. Now, that in theory, I think sounds great. I think the problem is in practice, it would be operated in a horribly divisive and unhelpful and bureaucratic way that means it wouldn't work. So, whilst I would say in theory I would like that, I just think it doesn't work. And I just go right back to my earlier point, which is that for those people who, maybe get a better state pension because they defer it, or get a better state pension because they're richer and they live longer, let's just tax the bastards.
Ah, right, tax the bastards. On your final
Yep.
words, right, because you're going to go.
On that
Yeah.
moment, but on that basis, I'm going. Sorry,
Yeah.
apologies. Nice to see you.
No, it's lovely to see you, Hillary, and thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. I think
Bye.
we can all say goodbye to Hillary for a little round of applause. That's brilliant. Okay. I do feel that we ought to just touch upon this question of means testing and of that whole bit of sectionalizing, because it's been discussed in various circles and so on, and I'm pretty sure I know what the views are. When I say sectionalizing, I mean, do we pay a higher state pension to certain parts of the country? You live in the shithole, you get a better state pension, that kind of approach. And I sense that this is not what we mean by solidarity. This is more DC pot country. That would be my feeling. But I will throw that open to Bryn and Andy just for their comments before we move to questions.
Yes, I think a universal benefit provided along the lines that Hillary's laid out, I think is what I see as fair, and where I see an additional role for the state, that's the state's role of providing that universal flat rate benefit, which people can increase if they defer their retirement. The target for that should be the subject of a revamped commission. I actually think the last pension commission did all the work, and if you reread what, as I do now and then, it does provide all the answers that are good enough to provide a solid basis for policy now. But there's probably an advantage in terms of informing and education, having a revived commission, and that could set targets. And if we had a target for what the basic state pension should be, then the need for the triple lock would fall away. There could be, if the target set by a commission was higher than the new state pension now, then it should come up with a proposed program of moving to that level, and that would be better. I'm only support the triple lock on purely pragmatic grounds. It's totally unjustified, apart from the fact that we don't actually have a target. If we had a target, we could do that job a lot better. Segmented provision, as I say, it moves against all that approach, that universalist approach, which of course goes all the way back to Beveridge. Beveridge, of course, proposed flat rate benefits. He also problematically suggested flat rate contributions, and that was the problem. And it was the belief that you had to have earnings related state pensions if you had earnings related state contributions that led to SERPs and so on. I still think that the state has a role to provide earnings related pensions in addition to this flat rate basic, and that's the way to provide segmented provision for those who need additional coverage. Everyone gets the universal flat rate pension, and the state has a role to support people. The obvious case there is care workers, unpaid care workers. I think the case is well established that the main reason for the gender pensions gap is that care is gendered. It's mostly provided by women, unpaid care, and because the target pension depends on having an employer-sponsored pension. If you're doing unpaid care, then you don't get an employer-sponsored pension, and that's one of the main reasons for the gender pensions gap. And so the state has a role of providing them with an equivalent to a automatic enrolment pension. I wouldn't do that by giving money to insurance companies. I would do it by the state promising them additional benefits in return. But so I think there is a role for segmented provision, but that's done through automatic enrolment. And where automatic enrolment doesn't work effectively, then the state has a role to provide a parallel system of additional pension credits paid alongside the state pension.
And before I come to Andy on that, just want to alert people who aren't following the chat, because there is the most extraordinary amount of chat on this call. I don't think we've ever seen so much, and it's fabulous to see such a great discussion going on in there. I'm not going to be able to come to all the questions. I am going to ask Andy one final question, which is about this whole business of, well, let's talk about integration with auto enrollment, as Bryn has put it up. You know, are we getting to a point where we will have some kind of means tested benefit because some people will have enough, or should we persist with the approach we have at the moment? Will auto enrolment be the factor that decides on this? In other words, your pension, like we have in Australia, is offset against your state pension. Your private pension is offset against your state pension, and is there an argument for some kind of segmentation by other factors? Andy, if you're still there.
My goodness, there are so many issues hanging around just now. I think on the segmented, and I'm going to just flash through one or two lessons from abroad. I was lucky enough to work in many countries, and I think we haven't talked about any other countries here, and I think they do provide an awful lot of lessons for us. So, for example, on segmented, Greece has had a very segmented approach to state pensions, where people in various industries and doing various kinds of job got some kind of preferential treatment. Some of that was through their occupational type social security pension, but some was through the general one. And there was a hell of a lot of arguments as to which kind of work deserved preferential treatment. The one I remember was hairdressers got preferential treatment because they were standing most of the day and had to work with various chemicals that were argued to reduce their expectation of life. And I think a lot of industries were doing that. It's a very difficult thing to do, and clearly to do it regionally again would be extremely difficult to justify, because as I think Bryn mentioned in a different context, there is more difference between people in Glasgow, for example, in their expectation of life than there is between Glasgow and, well, somewhere along the road from me, like Bournemouth, that might justify different levels of state pension because of different levels of expectation of life. So I think we just overcomplicate what should be simple and a basic level. Now, you did ask about means testing, and I think there's a confusion around means testing. We do have means testing with pension credit, and that is means testing at a very aggressive level, I would say. And then if you go to Australia, they have what is more like the withdrawal of the annual allowance if your income is over £100,000 kind of means testing. It's more removing it from the high earners rather than means testing as we know it in universal credit and pension credit. And if we think we're going to introduce a form of means testing, we need to be clear what we're talking about, because people just don't understand it anyway. I would only say that when I was in Mauritius, advising the Mauritius government about 20 years ago, an Australian was there and he suggested, they've got a very similar pension system to us, a basic pension, and oddly enough, a CDC funded top-up run by the state, which was quite an interesting lesson for us. The worst lesson for us is that 2 years ago they abandoned it and doubled the basic pension with the money that was in the pots. So there's always a political risk. But an Australian was there and he suggested they introduced the Australian form of asset and income testing. And there were riots in the streets. People did not understand what was being proposed. They thought they were going to lose their basic pension because they had a bit of savings. And it was pulled in the end. And it doesn't really save much money if it only applies to people with very high pensions. So it's hard, it's not really worth doing. Anyway, I better stop. There's too many other things I could say, and other people deserve a chance to ask questions.
You're on mute, Henry.
You're on mute.
You're on mute, Henry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, there's a bacon sandwich being made for me in the background, which is very, very noisy. Tom, sorry, does anyone want to put their hand up and actually ask a question, or just ask a question?
Well, or express a point of view.
Express a point of view. Yeah. Sorry. Ah, yes, Brian Gannon.
Yeah, really interesting conversation, guys and girls. Thank you so much. Really interesting to listen to sort of these different points of view. I think pensions are just but one part of the problem in the UK, and that if all we do is focus on making sure we try and protect one section of society, whether that be the elderly or the poor, it does lend itself to criticism from those in power, that and also younger people as well. We're not getting our fair crack of the whip because everybody is focusing on pensioners. And to be fair, it's true. If you look at sort of most pre-state retirement age benefits, most of them are largely means tested, other than health related ones such as PIP and things like that. And one of the problems that people have with having to wait until they're 66, 67, 68 to get the state pension is if they have a certain amount of money, and it can be as little as £6,000, they live with somebody else. As a couple, these people simply can't afford to live because their partner's still working. The other person simply doesn't qualify for any benefits. They may be in their late 50s, early 60s, and there's no option for people to take. I'll put in the chat, what about the concept of an early retirement factor that you get with DB pensions, giving people in that situation the option to take their state pension with actuarial reduction? Because that's simply the opposite of what you get when you defer the state pension. You get a late retirement factor of 5.8%. So why?
Yeah,
Just interested to know whether that's a possibility that could be introduced.
Hillary did touch on that. Yeah. Sorry,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, yes. Effectively, you could dress up the existing system in that very way. I'm sort of surprised it's not what I would propose, but those who a government could say, okay, we're going to increase the basic state pension, the new state pension, by 50%, but it's only going to be payable from 75. And if you want to take it earlier, you get a 5.8% reduction each year you take it early. Now, it's exactly what we've got at the moment. It's just the way it's presented.
Yeah. Except that you simply can't take it before you're 60. Well,
there's
66.
obviously got to be.
So if we could reduce, if we could extend the tail, but why does there have to be? Why does there have to be? Because actuarially,
I think
it's giving people choice who are going to die early, and there are lots of people in abject poverty.
Exactly. In practice, they're
who
never going to allow that to reduce your income below the pension credit level. in practical terms, because then you're sort of opting into receiving pension credit. I mean, I'm arguing from their point of view.
Yes,
here.
yeah, no, I appreciate that.
Personally, I'd have a bigger pension, and so people could take it even earlier than 66. But you can't take it before 66. They wouldn't let you take it before 66 because that will push you below the pension credit level.
So
I'm
in a
not
way,
going.
I
I'm
guess
not going
it's
to
the
go to Andy
fairness
on
of-
this. I'm going to go to Peter and then to Robert, so we can get everyone's point of view or question in, and then I will come back to Andy to comment. Peter.
Yes, thank you very much. Just express a certain personal dissatisfaction that I just missed out on the 2016 change by a month, and where my wife didn't. So as a consequence, I took my pension, and my wife deferred hers while we both continued to work for a number of years afterwards. But we were in that fortunate position, we were able to do that. I think the biggest problem with is in fact housing costs. If you are on low income, you cannot, unless you have inherited wealth, you cannot afford to purchase a house. When you come to retirement, you are then left with rental costs which inflate and have inflated far more than the pensions have done so. And you are left in much more significant. Would it not be better for the state to consider directing resources towards the equalisation of housing costs across society?
I'm going to go to Robert, and then I'm going to ask for a wrap up on that question and others from Andy and Bryn. Robert Cochrane.
Thanks, Henry, and thanks for the conversation today. My question's pretty simple, really. How do we get state pension better understood by the general public? Because, I mean, it's pretty clear from all the fights that you see on Twitter and all the internet generational stuff that you see going on, and from the people that we meet, that generally people don't have a good understanding of how they're accruing a state pension, or indeed on many occasions what they're entitled to get.
Okay, so a wrap really. I'm going to come to Andy first and then come back to you, Bryn. Two questions which we haven't touched on before. One, this question of housing equality, and secondly, the whole issue of pension awareness, which I guess touches on things like WASPI as well. Yeah.
Okay, I think I'll start with the pension awareness one. And hopefully the dashboard will contribute to making this an easier question for us to address. I mean, basic pension, the state pension is going to be simpler in the future for the vast bulk of people. So I would hope that combined with the dashboard, if it appears, will be useful. I hope the dashboard doesn't complicate it. And that's my worry, that if it only shows what people have accrued, people might think that's what they will get. Very simple problems, I think, with thinking of the general population. We are in a bubble here. We understand the difference between accrued and expected. And I think it always surprises me how little people understand about anything to do with pensions. I find that my two kids, who are teenagers, seem to understand more about it because they are lucky enough to have to listen to me. The housing has always been a problem. I mean, that has been a problem going back to the start of basic pension, national assistance, and how do we support housing and the unequal situation people find between those having rent and those having bought their houses. And I don't know the answer to this one. If we're going to have a commission, I don't think we need a pension commission. We probably do need a later life commission that will look at issues, because there are going to be bigger problems in future. And I'll just say one other thing and then I'll shut up. America does express its social security, its state pension, in an expected amount at age 67, and you can retire earlier or later with increments and decrements. And I'm all for, as Hilary said, making it 75 and showing that you can get a pension of £400 if you take it at 75, or at least you could if you were a pre-2016 me. Maybe £300 for the others. And if you take it out and you take it and expressing it, we need to decide whether we want more people to work. That's the real issue that we haven't discussed. And pensions, as I think I tweeted today, pensions are a real disincentive for people to work if they think they can retire. And so there's a catch-22 on how we deal with maintaining GDP as the population ages and all these issues. And that's what we need a pension commission to address, a savings commission.
Thank you very much for that. Bryn, do you want to round off our discussions?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, we won't get to everybody, but
housing is the problem in establishing the appropriate income people should receive, because it varies so much geographically, and it varies between people with different tenures. And no one's come up with a totally satisfactory answer. I think there needs to be a separate form of housing support, or else it doesn't work. Absolutely, the need for people to better understand their state pension. I'm not so optimistic about it becoming simpler. We're moving towards the new state pension, and the conditions are set in the way that virtually everyone will get the new state pension. But that's not for many, many years. There'll be people retiring in 40 years' time with still some pre-2016 rights. So the complexity issue isn't going away quickly. And so long as it's complicated, understanding is always going to be difficult. But absolutely, we should be more active in ensuring people understand what they're going to get from the state, because for most people, the state is their main source of income. I was going to bring some graphs, but I couldn't find the really nice ones I saw. But across the income distribution, the state pension is the key element of income for most people. That's
I think Steve
so important.
Did some really good graphs about just how much of our income.
I think it was one of Steve's.
Okay. Look,
more than 50% of people rely on the state pension for more than 50% of their income. It's the one that always sticks in my mind.
That's good.
50% of people don't know what 50% means. Okay. Or something similar. Thank you, Tom. And I'm sorry we haven't got time to come round to everybody. It's been the most interesting session. And I mean, it's brilliant to hear a completely different point of view. It may not be everyone's point of view, but it's certainly a different one. And I think it probably relates much more to the way people think about the state pension than a lot of the discussions we have inside our bubble. So thank you very much, Bryn. Thank you, Andy, and thank you to Hilary in absentia.
Because of the teams I've got, the aggressive security that applies, the chat tends to disappear. Do you think you could copy and circulate it? Because
we will try and get that for you.
I really don't know if you can.
I've never achieved it yet, but I'll have a go.
We'll try.
All right.
Cheers.
Thank you, Bryn, and thanks everybody for being on the call. Back to you, Steve, just to round things off, but I'll try and cut and paste this chat, which is about 200 lines long.
Absolutely, we'll try and get that chat out. And if anybody would like a copy of that chat, if we can get it, then please email myself or Henry on the usual email address. The video should be up this afternoon, which would be great for people that can look back on that or who couldn't attend today. Next week, we've got Steve Webb. So Steve, so the pre-2016 people can join and thank him, and the post-2016 people can really have a go at him. It'll be an ideal platform for you to have a go at Steve. But he's doing a new paper on magnetic pensions. Whatever magnetic pensions is going to be, I don't know. So join us next week for Sir Steve. And as usual, we pray for peace in the East, peace in the Middle East. And let's just pray for safe times ahead. And I hope everyone has a great day, a great week, and hopefully you can join us next Tuesday for Sir Steve Webb. Thanks, Bryn. Thanks, Andy. Listen, I also think maybe this state pension debate, we should have a second version later in the year. If Bryn and Andy's up for it, we should have a second version later in the year maybe and get some graphs and stats. But this, this is a big topic that affects everybody, including my granddaughter, who's 3 weeks old. So there you go. So what would you say to her? So there you go. But anyway, listen, thanks everybody. Really appreciate your attendance today, and thanks to Bryn, thanks to Andy, thanks to Henry, and thanks to Hilary. So enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much. Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you all.